In this lecture, you are going to learn about how the U.S. goes from neutrality to an arsenal of democracy, the Homefront, and war mobilization. Although Franklin Roosevelt agreed with most Americans that the nation's highest priority was to attack the domestic causes and consequences of the Depression, he had long advocated an active role for the United States in international affairs. Roosevelt's pursuit of international amity was constrained by economic circumstances and American popular opinion. He established formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1933, but did not act when Japan and Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. Foremost in the United States, hostilities in Asia and Europe only further reinforce isolationist sentiments. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937. The Neutrality Act of 1937 established the cash and carry policy, which sought to allow trade but prevent foreign entanglements by requiring warring nations to pay cash for non-military goods and transport them in their own ships. The desire for peace in France, Britain, and the United States led Germany, Italy, and Japan to launch offensives on the assumption that the Western democracies lacked the will to oppose them. Hostilities in Europe, Africa, and Asia alarmed Roosevelt and other Americans. Roosevelt sought to persuade Americans to moderate their isolationism and find a way to support the victims of fascist aggression. The strength of isolationist sentiments in the United States convinced Roosevelt that he needed to maneuver carefully if the United States were to help prevent fascist aggressors from conquering Europe and Asia, leaving the United States an isolated and imperiled island of democracy. By mid-June 1940, France had surrendered the largest army in the world, signed an armistice that gave Germany control of the entire French coastline in nearly two-thirds of the countryside. The new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, vowed that Britain, unlike France, will never surrender to Hitler. Churchill pleaded for American destroyers, aircraft, and munitions, but Britain lacked the funds to buy them. So Roosevelt arranged to swap 50 old destroyers for American access to British bases in the Western Hemisphere. In 1940, while German pilots bombed Britain, Roosevelt decided to run for an unprecedented third term as president. Empowered by voters after being elected president for another term, Roosevelt maneuvered to support Britain in every way short of entering the war. The United States will instead serve as the great arsenal of democracy. In January 1941, Roosevelt proposed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the British to obtain arms from the United States without paying cash, instead promising to reimburse the United States when the war ended. Then Hitler turned his massive army eastward, launching a surprise attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. As Germany raced across the Russian plains and Nazi U-boats tried to stop off supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union, Roosevelt met with Churchill and signed the Atlantic Charter, which called for, among other things, freedom of the seas and the right of nations to choose their own form of government. Although the likelihood of a war with Germany preoccupied Roosevelt, Hitler exercised a measure of restraint indirectly provoking America. Unlike the Germans, Japanese ambitions in Asia, especially in China and the Philippines, clashed more openly with American interests and commitments. In 1940, Japan signaled a new phase of imperial design by entering into a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy, the Tripartite Pact. Then, early on the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. was now at war. In a rush to produce military supplies, factories were converted from producing consumer goods to war materiel, and production was ramped up to record levels. To organize and oversee the tidal wave of military production, Roosevelt called upon business leaders to head the new government agencies, such as the War Production Board, which set production priorities and pushed for maximum output. Booming wartime production led to booming wartime employment that swelled union membership. To speed up production of wartime materials, the government asked unions to pledge not to strike during the war. Overall, conversion to war production achieved Roosevelt's ambitious goal of crushing superiority in military goods, and the United States managed to produce more than double the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The Second World War and its aftermath marked the decisive emergence of the United States as a global superpower. In this official 1943 poster, U.S. soldiers marched forward to fight for liberty against fascism while casting a sideways glance for inspiration at the ragged colonial militiamen of the Revolutionary War. Millions of American women gladly left home to take their places on assembly lines and defense industries. World War II brought unprecedented labor opportunities for American women. Industrial labor, an occupational sphere dominated by men, shifted in part to women for the duration of wartime mobilization. Women applied for jobs in converted munition factories. The iconic illustrated image of Rosie the Riveter, a muscular woman dressed in coveralls with her hair in a handkerchief and inscribed with the phrase, "We can do it," came to stand for female factory labor during the war. Government advertisements urged women to take industrial jobs by assuring them that their household chores had prepared them for work on the victory line. These ads typically were confined to the gender roles of the time, often showcasing women's efforts as a temporarily supportive role. However, women also work in various auxiliary positions for the government. Although such jobs were often traditionally gender-female, over 1 million administrative jobs at the local, state, and national levels were transferred from men to women for the duration of the war. Around 1 million women joined the workforce, and during the war, the workforce increases from 27 to 37% from 1940 to 1944. Despite the economic roses, most women would work on clerical jobs or as nurses, or will work on light industry and lower skilled or entry-level jobs. The majority of married women remain at home, occupied with domestic chores and childcare. But they also contributed to the war effort by planting victory gardens, collecting tin cans and newspapers for recycling into war materials, and buying war bonds. The demands of war restricted the types of consumer goods American families could buy, but most Americans had more money than ever before. This wartime prosperity and abundance contrasted with the experiences of their hard-pressed allies. Fighting against Nazi Germany and its ideology of Aryan racial supremacy forced Americans to examine racial prejudice in their own society. In 1941, Black organizations demanded that the federal government require companies receiving defense contracts to integrate their workforce. The WWII campaign was a campaign to attack racism at home and abroad. The campaign was officially supported by the NAACP, which asserted Black Americans' demands for the rights and privilege enjoyed by all other Americans. The campaign pushed the federal government to require defense contractors to integrate their workforces. At the time, Douglas Aircraft employed only 10 Black employers of 30,000. North American, 9 of 12,000. Lockheed Bega, 54 of 48,000. Responding to this pressure, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which authorized the Committee on Fair Employment Practices to investigate and prevent race discrimination in employment. However, the FEPC was never wholly effective, as it was severely underfunded and understaffed. So progress came slowly. Although black unemployment dropped by 80% during the war's end, the average income of black families still stood at half of that of white families. Blacks' migration to defense jobs intensified racial tensions, which boiled over in the summer of 1943, when 242 race riots erupted in 47 cities. Racial violence gave importance to the WWII campaign. The campaign achieved only limited success against racial discrimination during the war. Industrial jobs increased 13% between 1940 and 1944. Employment rose with the war, and by 1943, the number of African Americans working in aircraft production industries rose to 2,000 at Douglas, 2,500 in North American, and 1,700 at Lockheed. There were virtually no Mexican Americans employed in LA shipyards in 1941, but by 1944, there were around 7,000 working. But this progress was temporary, and many of these jobs will not continue in the post-war years. Rosita the Riveter, a Mexican-American woman, explains. During the war, there was a lessening of discrimination by some public places only because they needed our money, with so many angles in the service. After the war, some restaurants, stores, and taverns again refused to serve us on equal basis with whites. We knew this was totally unfair because we had worked hard to win the war. My generation realized we had to do something to change this condition, not only for ourselves, but for the next generation. Men and women power was not only needed in industry jobs, but also in agriculture. With men away fighting the war, the U.S. looked outside its borders to be able to meet the job demand. When a decade ago, the U.S. managed to deport thousands of Mexican legal residents and U.S. citizens during World War II, the U.S. instituted the Bracero program. The program was a temporary contract worker program started in by agreement with Mexico in 1942 to meet the labor need during the war. The program provided cheap labor for the U.S., and although the program was supposed to be for the duration of the war, the cheap labor was so convenient for U.S. farmers that it lasted all the way into the 1960s. An estimated 4.5 million Mexicans came to the U.S. under the Bracero program. The manpower was also needed in the armed forces. In 1940, Roosevelt encouraged Congress to pass the Selective Service Act to register men of military age who would be subjected to a draft into the armed forces if the need arose. The act also prohibited discrimination based on race or color. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only propelled U.S. to war, but it also fueled patriotism, and Americans of every corner of the U.S. will join the fight. President Roosevelt and his administration had encouraged all able-bodied American women to help the war effort. He considered the role of women in the war critical to American victory, and the public expected women to assume various functions to free men for active military service. While most women opted to remain at home or volunteer with charitable organizations, many wore a military uniform. Women were barred from combat duty, but they worked at nearly every non-combat task, eroding traditional barriers to women's military service. Over 350,000 women serve in several all-female units of the military branches. The Army and Navy Nurse Corps Reserves, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Navy Women's Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, the Coast Guard SPARS, named for the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, and Marine Corps units gave women the opportunity to serve as either commissioned officers or enlisted members at military bases at home and abroad. Fran Vera was a member of a women's parachute troop in San Diego during World War II. The women were trained in first aid and will have parachuted behind enemy lines to care for the wounded if necessary. The Nurse Corps Reserves alone commissioned 105,000 Army and Navy nurses recruited by the American Red Cross. Military nurses work at base hospitals, mobile units, and on board Hospital Mercy ships. The Selective Service Act prohibited discrimination on account of race or color. African American men and women, as did Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and every other American served. Homosexuals also served in the armed forces, and like other minorities, they sought to demonstrate their worth under fire. More than 1 million African Americans fought in the war. Most blacks served in segregated non-combat units led by white officers. However, some gains were made. The number of black officers increased from 5 in 1940 to over 7,000 in 1945. The all-black pilot squadrons known as the Tuskegee Airmen completed more than 1,500 missions, escorted heavy bombers into Germany, and earned several hundred merits and medals. Many bomber crews especially requested the Red-Tailed Angels as escorts, and near the end of the war, the Army and Navy began integrating some of their units and facilities. Half a million Mexican Americans also served during World War II. $25,000 Native Americans also served. $13,000 Chinese Americans serve as well. and around 30,000 Japanese Americans fought for the United States in World War II. Most famously, about 14,000 men served in the regimental combat team, earning 9,486 Purple Hearts, all while many of their family members were imprisoned in internment camps. The United States entered the war in a crippling economic depression and with a disseminated fleet after Pearl Harbor. In 1939, the U.S. had around 6,000 airplanes. By 1944, the U.S. will have more than 96,000 airplanes. By 1945, the U.S. had thousands of tanks, airplanes, ships, and millions of machine guns and rifles. The Army went from 200,000 soldiers in 1939 to 8 million in 1945. The United States Armed Forces number over 15 million by the end of the war. The rapid and mass mobilization by the U.S. will be a crucial aspect to the outcome of the war. That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn more.